Now, we are transitioning to classical period. The music of classical period. Classical music is from 1750 to 1820. We are now on La Scala Theatre or Teatro alla Scala, as the local called it. La Scala is famous opera house in Milan. The theater was inaugurated on August 3, 1778 and was originally known as the Nuovo Regio Ducale Teatro alla Scala. This painting is named Lezion di Musica by Traversi Gaspare. The painting represents the trend of classical music. In classical era, artists, architects, and musicians move away from the heavily ornamented style of Baroque and Rococo, and instead embrace a clean, uncluttered style they thought reminiscent of classical Greece. But it happened slowly. The orchestra during the Baroque period was still popular during the classical period. Classical music as genre implies balance and utilizes a complete set of section of symphonic instrument since then up to now. Musical genres during the medieval, Renaissance, and the Baroque periods were also popular during the classical period. This shows the evolutionary development of music that suits the satisfaction and taste of musical public. The newly established aristocracies were replacing monarchs and the church as patrons of the arts, and were demanding an impersonal but tuneful and elegant music. Dances such as minuet and gavotte were provided in the forms of entertaining serenades and divertimenti. Let's discuss the classical period genres. First, the chamber music. Chamber music is composed for a small group of solo musicians and it can be performed by around 10 players or more. The string quartet is the most familiar type of composition for a chamber group. It has two violins, a viola, and a cello. All the parts are equally important. The two violins have the highest parts. The viola plays the middle and the cello has the lowest part. Next genre, we have choral music. Choral music is the music written specifically for such an ensemble to perform. Choirs may perform music from the classical music repertoire, which spans from the medieval era to the present, or popular music repertoire. Most choirs are led by a conductor who leads the performance with arm, hand, and facial gestures. Next, we have classical crossover. Classical crossover is a genre that hovers between classical and popular music and is usually targeted at fans of both types of music. Next, we have high classical. It is focused on the high regard for very classical music of the period, like the support of the opera, the sonata, the trio, the quartet, and the concerto. And let's discuss Impressionism. Impressionism in music was a movement in European classical music, mainly in France, which appeared in the late 19th century and continued into the beginning of the 20th century from 1875 to 1925. Similarly to its precursor in the visual arts, musical impressionism focuses on a suggestion and an atmosphere. Minimal music is a form of art music or other compositional practice that employs limited or minimal music materials. Prominent features of minimalist music includes repetitive patterns or pulses, steady drones, consonant harmony, and reiteration of musical phrases or smaller units. And last but definitely not the least, the most famous of them all, the opera. The opera is a form of theater in which music is fundamental component and dramatic roles are taken by singers. Such a work, well, work is a literal translation of Italian word opera, is typically a collaboration between composer and librettist and incorporates a number of performing arts such as acting, scenery, costume, and sometimes dance or ballet. The performance is typically given in opera house, accompanied by orchestra or smaller musical ensemble, which since the early 19th century has been led by a conductor. The characteristic of music during the classical period in terms of contrast, rhythm, texture, melody, dynamics, and piano in the classical forms. Contrast in mood in classical music may change gradually or suddenly. Also, a classical music does have flexibility and wide array of rhythmic pattern use. Texture is being treated the same as rhythm, and usually in homophony, in which there are shifts in a gradual or sudden manner. Melody, considered as the most tuneful, easy to remember, and sound balanced. Dynamic and piano focus on the interest of expressing shade of emotions that leads to a widespread of gradual dynamics changes. Classical form is a composition that has 4 parts, namely fast movement, slow movement, dance-like movement, and fast movement. Classical music terminologies. Classical music period brought some of these musical terminologies that keep ringing on the ears of the music aficionados. We have the sonata, also called first movement form or sonata allegro form. The basic elements of sonata form are 3: exposition, development, and recapitulation, in which the musical subject matter is stated, explored, or expanded, and restated. Theme and variation is very common musical structure you will come across, especially in classical music. The structure is built upon a musical idea called the theme, which is played at the start of the piece. Next term, symphony. A symphony is an extended musical composition in Western classical music. A symphony usually contains at least one movement or episode composed according to the sonata principle. Next term is the classical concerto. The classical concerto is the piece of music composed for an instrumental, soloist, or orchestra. It is written to feature the musical skills and expressiveness of a single musician. Next term, classical chamber music. Designed for an intimate setting of a room or a palace that usually involve 2 to 9 players only consists of fast, slow, dance-like movement, and fast movement. Musical instrument of classical music. We will begin on strings. Musicians play some string instrument by plucking the strings with their fingers or a plectrum, and other by hitting the string with a light wooden hammer or by rubbing the strings with a bow. For example, violin, viola, cello, double bass, and sometimes guitar, or even the 47-string harp. Woodwind. Woodwind instrument use a whistle-type mouthpiece such as flute and piccolo. Air is blown across the edge of the mouth hole. That include piccolo, flute, oboe, bassoon, English horn, and clarinet. Brass. Brass instruments are essentially very long pipes that widen at their ends into bell-like shape. The pipes have been curved and twisted into different shapes to make them easier to hold and play. That includes trumpet, French horn, trombone, and tuba. Next, we have percussions. Percussion instruments keep the rhythm, making special sounds and add excitement and color to the music. This includes timpani and sometimes triangle, hand cymbals, and bass drums. Famous composers of classical period. Classical music is miracle to music ages, and here's the stars of this period. They are the most exceptional composers in the history of music. First, Joseph Haydn. He was born on March 31, 1732, and on 31st of May, 1809, he died. He was an Austrian composer of classical period. He was instrumental in the development of chamber music, such as the string quartet and piano trio. His contribution to musical form have led him to call the father of symphony and the father of string quartet. He spent 30 years as musical director of Esterhazy family and composed 2 opera and 2 concerto. He was a good friend and a great teacher. Now, we have Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Hands down, to the greatest musician and composer ever. At the young age of 3, he has perfect pitch. At 5, he mastered the harp. At 6, he has first composition. At age of 8, he wrote his first symphony. He is a good friend to Joseph Haydn. He had written 34 symphonies, 5 operas, 16 quartets, and over 100 other works when he was only 18. He don't have patrons because he works freelance. But with his short life of 35 years, he died with 600 composition to his name. This music playing in the background, he died while composing this. Luckily, his student have enough information to finish it. Ludwig van Beethoven, a German composer and pianist. Beethoven remains one of the most admired composers in the history of Western music. His works rank amongst the most performed of the classical music repertoire and span the transition from classical period to the Romantic era in classical music. He moved to Vienna when he was 17 and became a student of Joseph Haydn. Unlike Mozart, Beethoven works with many patrons. He constantly falling in love in high-class ladies yet he never got married. He became deaf on 1802, yet he still composes music. Unfortunately, he died on 1827. For more visualization, here is the timeline of these composers. Here it includes Sebastian Bach from the Baroque period. This ends my discussion for classical period of music. Thank you for watching.